We are going to talk today about our world. If you haven't noticed, our world is a mess. As we begin listening to the news, as we read papers or books, we begin seeing that the world is just absolutely full of conflicts, nation against nation and people against people and politician against politicians. Two that are dominating our news right now. The Russian-Ukraine war, over a year. They've been bombing each other's cities. They've been killing each other's soldiers. It always affects the civilian population. Every war, there's always been more civilians that have died than soldiers in the conflict. And there's always been more soldiers that have died than the politicians that started the war. But we're faced with that. And I don't know when it's going to end. They don't know which side's going to give on that. And the other one happens to be the Israeli-Gaza thing. Again, this is an ongoing, repetitive situation and a conflict. It has been a conflict that has gone on now for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years. And different people have tried to side in and solve this, and I'm not sure it's ever going to be solved. I just know that it will simmer down, and then it'll boil up again. And this is what we live with. And this is when we turn the news on. This is what we hear. And we're confronted with the numbers that 40,000 people have died on one side and thousands on the other side have died, and which cities have been bombed and where the immigrants have tried to go. And then that conflict has now spread, as the conflicts so often do. It just draws in the rest of the people around about them. And so Israel now also against Iran, and that's pulled us at least into some type of action. We have not declared war. But that's life for us. And I began thinking about this, and I did a search. There's some good things about the internet, a lot of bad things, but some of the good things is you can find information. And so I just began doing a search of all of the armed conflicts that are going on in the world right now. Some of them dominated our news a year ago, 3 years ago, and now we never hear about them again, but they still go on. And the poor people that are having to live with it, it's still going on, and they are suffering. It's just that news is not news if it's not new. And so we're on to the next one and on to the next one. But let me just run through this very quick. The Sudanese civil war started in 23, still going on. The Syrian has a civil war going on. Yemen has a civil war going on. The Red Sea crisis, because of the Houthis that are rising up and causing all of the problems for the shipping lanes and what's going on. In Ethiopia, there's another civil conflict that is between the politicians. The Democratic Republic of Congo, it has been in a war situation for now 50, 60 years. It's just going to continue. And then Afghan. We went in and we fought, and then we left, and they just continued fighting, but they were fighting before we got there, and they're still fighting on that. Haiti. It had that terrible earthquake that destroyed so much. And then what took place was the gangs have arisen. And so the conflict is not between two armies per se, but between the gangs that are running everything, and they control the food. So the people are starving and they can't get food even though we send it in. The gangs take it over and they give it to who they want to. It's a mess. The Kurdish-Turkish conflict. Turkey has been in constant civil wars and problems ever since the end of World War II. The Mexican drug war. Again, the gangs that are trying to dominate the amount of the war. Somalia, a civil war. Nigeria, there are conflicts going on. In Kashmir, the problem between the India and Pakistan, and that just always seems to boil up. And it did again. Our country, we're not free from that. Just 2 weeks ago, some of our politicians were assassinated by people they didn't like, and the attempt upon the president, and we've had presidents that have been assassinated on that. The demonstrations, and they're not peaceful demonstrations in spite of which side is trying to describe that. Most of the time, if it's your house that gets burned, it's not a peaceful demonstration. And so what we have is people have taken to the streets, and if it was peaceful, okay. But they turn into riots, and they turn into destructions on that. The problem of immigration, the illegal immigration, and what do we do about it? And the politicians have argued about that for hundreds of years. Clear back when the Irish were coming in, and then the Italians were coming in. It's always been a problem. It will continue to be a problem. And the crime. San Angelo is pretty safe. Compared to Tucson, it's safer. But we have a crime rate. And if you want to, just open up the daily newspaper and they'll tell you all of the different crimes and which ones have been arrested and that. So even our little city here, there is the crime and aggression that goes on. There are drugs in our city. Human trafficking, we never hear about that, but it's happening in our country and all over the world. And child abuse, both in the family and against just children that's going on. You all see what I'm getting at? Our world's a mess. People don't act right. People don't live right. They don't do what needs to be done. And yet, the majority of us just want to be at peace and be left alone, to be able to take care of our families and do our jobs or work. And that's true in almost every country. But there's these others, and they're not content. And so there will be the wars, and there's going to be the factions. And sometimes within our own families, there's spousal abuse, mostly from the male side of that. And again, it's there. And we see it, and we hear it, etc., etc. Are you all sick of it? I am. I'm tired of it. But I know that it was that way. I used to talk about how things were so much better in the good old days. And then I began reading history. And I'm going to tell you, I don't know how far back you'd have to. Well, I do. You'd have to go back before Adam and Eve sinned in order to get to the really good old days. But ever since then. So, the question is, and this gets asked all the time in debates about God, where is God when it hurts? If God is all powerful and God is so good, why does He let all of this go on? One of the best answers I ever heard was this fella that was a believer. He got called in because his boss liked to pick on him. And his boss said, why doesn't God just strike people that are doing bad things with lightning? And the other man looked at him and said, I guess you would probably be first. And it's true. I'm glad God doesn't strike all liars with fire like he did Ananias and Sapphira over in the book of Acts, because I'd have been dead long ago. I didn't always tell the truth. A problem as a teenager. I'm just saying, we've all been there. We've all done that. And the reason that God doesn't is God has a different purpose and God has a different concept of what he is trying to do. And I'm going to tell you, if you've already figured this out, if you want to do bad things, God will let you. But there will be consequences. And eventually, you will be judged for what's going on. But to say all of that, I will strongly affirm that God is the sovereign ruler of the universe. Not just of America or not just of our planet, but if there were other beings somewhere else, God's in charge. He's in charge of the sun and the moon and the stars and the galaxies there. Now, when we talk about the word sovereign, that's a word that we just don't use in our vocabulary, and not very often. Some preachers do. It simply means that he will bring about the proper time. He who is blessed and the only sovereign, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. God has promised this. And so the word that was describing God here is sovereign. And if you want to know what that is, it means he's king over all the kings. He is Lord over all the Lord. He is the ruler. He has the power to decree and the power to judge and the power to punish and the power to bless. It is God that is in charge. One of my favorite passages, 1 Chronicles chapter 29. A prayer. Thine, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty, for all that is in the heaven and in the earth is thine. Thine is the kingdom, O Lord. Thou art exalted as head above all. Both riches and honor, they come from thee. And thou reignest over all. And in thine hand is power and might. And in thy hand is to make great and to give strength unto all. And now therefore, O God, we thank you and we praise thy glorious name. We don't pray like that. We ought to. We ought to be so full of our appreciation and knowledge and acknowledgement of God and who He is and what He has done, that this is continually upon our lips. So mark this and find a newer translation so it's not King Jamesy, but you can speak it in our own language and begin including these concepts and these phrases in your prayers. Turn your attention away from the TV and the news and the internet and now begin focusing. God is in heaven and God is God over all. And that is the story of the Bible. Years ago, as I was trying to teach a survey course of the Old Testament where I was preaching, it dawned on me. The Bible story is not the story of Moses and David and Samson. But we get our children in the room and we begin teaching them all these Bible stories. And the stories are almost never about God. They're about men. And the real story is not David. The real story is God's response to David. What God did to David. How God treated David. It's not about Samson. You know, I know Samson got listed in Hebrews 11 as one of the men of faith. But you realize when you read Samson, he was not a very nice guy the majority of his life. Not a very godly character. He ended in faith. But the story is not about Samson. The story is about God. God gave him power. God gave him strength. And it's God that rescued him and used him. The story is about God. So follow with me now. By the way, I printed up the outline of this, and it's on the little table in the back. You don't have to take notes, just listen. You remember, in the garden, everything was good. And God only gave them 2 rules. And one rule was, don't eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And they ate of it. Eve ate it first, and she gave to her husband, and he ate. And God then had to bring judgment upon them. There's always consequences, particularly with sin, and so it began. The world was a mess. Adam and Eve had sinned. And then they had their children, and Cain came along. And Cain could have done good, but he chose not to. God confronted Cain and warned him that sin crouches at the door and is just waiting for an opportunity, like a lion or a leopard waiting to attack. And that's the way sin was. But God told him, you can resist it. You must resist it. And you know the story. He didn't. Instead, he rose up and he killed his brother. And I've often wondered, what do you think went through Adam and Eve's thinking when they saw their dead son on the ground? Realizing it was their other son that had to have done it. And so the world to them fell apart at that point. And then the story continues, and finally in Genesis 6, God saw that the mind of men, the thoughts of men was upon evil. And that continually, and God said, I'm sorry I even made them. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to destroy them. I'm going to start all over. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, and God allowed Noah and his family to be saved. But God destroyed all that had the breath of life except for those 8 precious souls. God's not concerned with numbers. God's concerned with righteousness. And so those that were unrighteous died. And then following that, the story of the Tower of Babel, where they were going to build a stairway. And God said no. And God had the power. He changed their languages. Amazing. Where did they learn to speak all those languages? They didn't learn to speak them. God caused them to speak them. And God caused them to separate. When I started making my trips to China, one of the questions we were asked all the time as we started reading the story is, where does China fit into this story? And I'd always take them here to the Tower of Babel, because they left there and they went east and they ended up in the whole history of India and China and Australia and South America. It all goes from there. But this was the story. God did that. And the rest of the story, starting in Genesis 12, narrows its focus. And it's really only going to talk about Abraham and Abraham's descendants and those nations as they touched this. There's a lot of nations that are not ever mentioned. We know about them from archaeology and from history, but they're not part of the Bible story because we're trying to get from Abraham to Jesus, and they don't fit. They were important to those people, but they're not important to this story of God telling this. So the story now is about Abraham's descendants, what we know as Israel. And we're going to deal, first of all, with the patriarchs, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Israel. That's the book of Genesis. And I'm going to tell you, one of the best statements in that whole book is God keeps telling each one of these, I will be with you. And He was. And everywhere they went, God was there in their life, acting, protecting, punishing, bringing to judgment, blessing them. It was the story of God, not the story of Abraham, nor the story of Isaac. It's like the story of Jacob when he went down to Egypt and was enslaved and then was freed. And he could say to his brothers, you meant that for evil when you sold me into slavery. But God meant that for good. And I've often wondered, if Jacob or Joseph thought that when he was on the back of the Midianite camel on his way into slavery, or did he only see that after all of the events? But aren't you aware? It was God that made him who he was. It was God that protected him. It was God that saved him. It was God that raised him up. It was God. The story is about the sovereignty of God. And so now we have that story. Abraham started it, and God promised him a land, and God gave him that land. And then the story of going down into Egypt and how God protected him while he was down there. The story of Lot, the conflict that they had, and Lot being taken captive and Abraham being able to protect him and get him back from that. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah, when they were evil. The fire from heaven destroyed the two cities, but Lot was rescued. And then Abraham's problem that he didn't have a child, but God had promised a child. At 100 years old, God provides the child. And thus we have the story of them. And it goes on through Isaac and through Jacob and then finally to the nation of Israel. And they're sold into bondage down there. Exodus starts. There arose a king that knew not Joseph, and he evilly entreated the people of Israel. He made slaves out of the whole nation of them. And 400 years they were slaves. Our country is 200 years. We got 200 more years, if you can imagine that. And they were slaves in that. And the child, Moses, and how he became adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter and raised as part of the royalty of that. And then flees into the desert and learns to live in the desert. And then God sends him back. And when he comes back, it's God that brings them out. It's God that presents the plagues. It's God that confronts Pharaoh and destroys the Egyptian. And God brings them into the wilderness. But God's not done yet. God is sovereign. I don't care how powerful Egypt and their Pharaoh is. God is sovereign. God destroys and God raises up and God rules over them. And so now Moses brings them through the desert. A lot of complaining, a lot of problems, and God gives them water and God takes away the water. And God gives them quail and God gives them... But the story is more about God and not all of the complaining that they did. God did what He said and He brought them in. And Joshua takes over. And now they have to conquer all of the cities. And when they're faithful to God, they conquer all these cities. But the opening part, when they were unfaithful, God had the same power to have them lose the battle. And they won or lost depending on their relationship to God, their faithfulness to God, because God is sovereign in the men. And then the book of Judges. And again, every man did what was right in their own sight. And it was a mess. And they did evil. And so God would raise up the Moabites or the Ammonites. And they would come in and they would conquer part of the land. And they would rule over them. But guess who was actually ruling? It was God that brought them in, and God that took them out of the story. God punished and God rewarded the people. And though it's not the story then of the judges, it's the story of God and how God expects His people to live. And then, towards the end of this, something that the Bible really doesn't address, but is an absolutely monumental thing. The Bronze Age world, and it included all the way up into Macedonia and Greece and over to Spain and all the way over to Iran and India and all the way down to Egypt. That whole world of empires collapsed at the same time. People are just astounded when they study history. All of the trades stopped. And what happened was there's this vacuum. No political power is controlling any of that. And you know what God did at that point in time? God raised up David. This kingdom that God had promised. It didn't happen by overthrowing all of the different powers. God overthrew the powers, and there was no power. And He raised up Saul, David, and Solomon, and they began to rule all the way from the river of Egypt down in the south, all the way up to the Euphrates River. And the reason they could do that was God. It was God that was the sovereign over all of that. They demanded a king, which was a rejection of God being their king. And yet, when God gave them an earthly king, God still was a ruler. God was the king, Lord of lords, the sovereign over all. And then the divided kingdom happened. And again, God brought that about. And Jeroboam, with all of his sins involved, was raised up to be part of that. And the northern 10 tribes were absolutely awful. They had all of these kings, and none of them were any good. And God allowed them, and God allowed to rule, and the other nations not to conquer them, until finally God had had enough. And God raised up the Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrians now came down, and they destroyed the northern 10 tribes. So there was no more northern Israel, or Israel as it was called. God did that, and God ruled over the Assyrians. Meanwhile, what's not mentioned is all of the history of China is going on over here. All of the history of India and their kings and their rulers. All of those that somewhere else in the world, because God's story. But I'm going to tell you what. God was as much the sovereign over China and Africa and Russia as He was this story. But this story points out it's God that is the king. And so Judah now was left by itself, and they didn't straighten up. And so God did the unthinkable. God had raised up Assyria to destroy the north, and now He raises up Babylon. Amazing. He even called the king by name 100 years before he was born. God raised him up. And Babylon, which had been an ancient city, now becomes, in a matter of a few short years, this world power. It destroyed Assyria, and then it kept on going, and it destroyed Egypt, and it conquered Judah and made slaves out of all of them. An interesting story reading the book of Daniel to show you the sovereignty of God. The king of Babylon was not a godly man, and so he built a big idol, and he commanded, everybody, when we blow the trumpets and the music, you will bow down and worship this. This is our God. This is the one that controls the world. And Daniel's 3 friends said, won't do it. If you don't do it, I'm going to throw you in the fiery furnace. Our God can save us if He wants to. But even if He doesn't, we're not bowing down to that. And they threw Him in the fiery furnace. But God's sovereignty, God's power, God's rule, God's authority, they came out of it. And they didn't even smell like fire or smoke. Nothing harmed them. God is sovereign to finish His story His way. And so they ruled for about 90 years, and they weren't doing any well, and God wanted to return Israel to the land. So God raised up the Median-Persian Empire. And they destroyed the Babylonians overnight. And then they said to all of the people that had been conquered by Babylon, go home, we'll pay for it. And that included Israel. And so God brought them back to the land that He gave to David. And they built the temple and they lived in the land. And then the story goes on because He raised up Alexander the Great, who conquered Turkey, all of Turkey, all the way to India and all the way down to Egypt. And he spread the Greek language and the Greek influence from that. And then He raised up the Romans, who defeated all of the Greeks. And the Romans built roads and gave a period of peace so that the gospel could spread. How could Paul get from Israel all the way up to Rome? And the answer is he walked, because there were all these roads. And it was protected. As a Roman citizen, he was protected. And so God was behind that. It wasn't Rome. It was God that allowed for all of this. And now Jesus becomes king. And do you remember Jesus with Pontius Pilate? And Pontius Pilate says, don't you know, because Jesus is not talking to him, don't you know I have the power, the authority to let you go free or put you to death? And Jesus simply said, and I think He said it in a normal voice, you would have no power at all, except God gave it to you. In that simple phrase is this morning's sermon. The sovereignty of God. All of these kings and all of these rulers that think they're so mighty and so powerful and so... it's only because God allows it. And when God's had enough of them, it'll end. I don't know how, I don't know when, but I know they're not in charge. God is in charge. So through all of this world history, y'all just covered the Old Testament, by the way, and it doesn't quit. Because what I wanted you to see was that story is not about the people. The story is about God. Our God is God of gods, King of kings, Lord of lords. He is our sovereign. He is sovereign over all, even today. All of the world. Yeah, I know the world is a mess, but God is still the ruler. So what in the world am I supposed to do about it? I can't solve the conflicts. If I was powerful, I could raise up an army and start another conflict. And then somebody would raise up an army and defeat my army. And the conflict's just going to continue to go. And we'll never solve all of the conflicts. They're just going to go on until Jesus comes again. And that will end all of these conflicts. The basis of all of this is God is the creator. God created the heavens and the earth. God created man in His own image. And God rules over men, wanting them to live in that. And God is free to do what God will do. Nobody tells God what He will or has to do. And God does what is right. And so the expressions of sovereignty, God simply chooses to do something. I'm going to destroy everybody on the earth, days of Noah. Nobody voted on that. Nobody overrid that. God decided and God did. And so God causes things to happen. God commands people to do certain things. Sometimes God doesn't command to do it. He just gives you permission to do that. He didn't command me to marry my wife, but He allowed me to choose whom I would. And so I asked her if she would, and she had a choice. Why she made the choice, I'm not sure yet, but she chose. And we chose, and we chose. You all chose to get up and come to church this morning. Thank you. It's a good choice. But you know, a lot of people in our country chose not to. In fact, they got up and they're doing things they're not supposed to do. It's a matter of choice. But sometimes God simply steps in and prevents. Paul wanted to go on a mission journey. No. The Holy Spirit came and said, no, can't go there. Wow. God is the sovereign. And all of these are ways that God does. And we try to figure it out. We try to anticipate what God is going to do. And we're not right. We simply don't know. So these are difficult times. I quit watching the news. If something really important happens, you'll probably tell me about it. And I'll find out. But I can't do anything about it anyway. I can't solve the war in Iran. I cannot solve the war in Ukraine. I cannot solve the difference between Republican and conservatives and liberals. And I can vote, and I'll do what I can do, but I'm not going to solve it, and you're not going to solve it. So what can we do? It's just difficult times. If God is ruling, and He is, then why? I don't know. I quit asking the question why. Because I don't know. But again, God's sovereignty eventually is going to be shown in judgment. For we will all face the judgment seat of Christ. 2 Corinthians 5 verse 10. Or if you like the other one, Hebrews 9:27, it's appointed unto man. Who appointed that? God. It's appointed unto man, that's humans, to die, and then the judgment. There will be a judgment. All these people that are doing these things, they're not getting away with it. God knows, and God will bring them to judgment. So, I'm just going to give you a couple things to think about and to do. Peter said, let those who suffer according to the will of God entrust their soul to a faithful Creator. Entrust your soul by doing what is right, because God has asked us to do that, and that's the measure of our faith and our trust. But I need to trust God. And you know, it's easy to trust God when life is going well and it's easy to live. What do you do when it's not easy? When the world falls apart, when your country is attacked, that's when it's hard. But that's when I need to trust God, not politicians, not armies. Entrust your soul to God, because God is faithful. I don't know how God's going to solve all these wars, but He will. And He will bring the evildoers to judgment. You all believe that? You willing to simply let God be God? You willing to trust that that's what God is going to do? That's what He asked us to do. And then He said, we're supposed to pray. 1 Timothy chapter 2. First of all, that means pay attention. This is important. First of all, I urge that entreaties and prayers and petitions and thanksgivings be made on behalf of all men, for kings and for all who are in authority. What am I supposed to pray for? I pray that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life. Not riches, not power, not that our side wins and their side loses. I pray, and not just for our people. We need to learn. We have brethren that live in these countries that it's difficult. Pray for them. Pray for their leaders. Pray that we can have a peaceful and quiet life, and they can too. That's our prayer. So I trust God, and I pray. And then I get up and try to do the best I can do to do what He's asked me to do. And God will take care of it. God is God. So is our world a mess? Has been since the beginning. But God's in charge. And I'm looking forward to that day when God finishes and we live in the presence of God and there is no evil and war and death and problem. Praise God, it's coming. Let's be faithful to His calling. You need to do that. You need to start by becoming a Christian. You need to believe the gospel. And in believing the gospel, that one's not going to work, Jeff. You need to believe the gospel. You need to arise, be baptized because Jesus said so, and then spend the rest of your life trying to do what God wants you to do, looking forward to and trusting Jesus. If you're willing to do that, we invite you to come as together we stand and sing.